Welcome to Kirkcaldy Civic Society's series of virtual heritage walkabouts. This one covers the central area of Kirkcaldy and in particular the High Street. Okay, let's look at a bit of context for our story about the High Street. Let's go back the best part of 1,000 years. Let's go back to 1066. Of course, down in England, William the Conqueror is defeating King Harold at the Battle of Hastings. Up in Scotland, our king is Malcolm III, otherwise known as Malcolm Canmore. The mid-11th century is when so many things change, though. Malcolm Canmore lost his first wife and then married his second wife, Margaret, in round about 1070. And that was a very, very significant moment in time. Malcolm Canmore himself was very, very much a warlord king. Scotland had not been properly formed by that time. The southern bit of Fife, where Kirkcaldy lies, 200 years before that was still Pictish speaking. That became Scots Gaelic speaking. But right across the Firth of Forth in the Lothians, that was an area which was Old English speaking, and further to the west of that, in the kingdom of Strathclyde, that was Old Welsh speaking. So things were so much different then. But nevertheless, from almost exactly from the moment that Malcolm Canmore married Margaret, things were to change. So we'll look at some of the details associated with that and how that affected Kirkcaldy. So while Malcolm Canmore was very, very much in the traditional style of warlord king, trying to consolidate his realm, Margaret was an entirely different person with different experiences. She brought, being an exiled Anglo-Saxon princess, a lot of the new continental thinking in terms of how things should be organised. And she started a process which was continued by her sons for a considerable period after that in reforming Scotland, both in terms of the church and also secularly. Margaret introduced the church structure of Roman Catholicism, and also the feudal system was introduced by her and was further consolidated over the next 2 centuries. In terms of religion, we see much more formal structures appearing than had existed in Scotland before that. We see priories appearing, we see abbeys appearing, we have cathedrals, we have a hierarchical structure, we have parishes for local religious observance, we have parish priests. Very, very much a change from what had happened in Scotland before that, which tended towards the Chaldean. And therefore that had effects that we'll see shortly. Another aspect was we had the creation of shires as a way of breaking down local areas into smaller parts for easier administration purposes. And the feudal system created a much more rigid structure where the monarch was the feudal superior of the whole realm, and then there were various layers of people underneath that, all the way down to serf level. In terms of shires and parishes, very often they directly coincided with each other, or very nearly. If you look at the map, you see Abbot's Hall Parish and Kirkcaldy Parish. That was an indication of the parish structure after 1650. But much before that, that was one single parish, and that was indeed Kirkcaldy Parish, and it had a single parish church, which we will talk about later. There is some debate about exactly what the shire was, because there was a shire of Kirkcaldy, and one assumption is that indeed it was more or less the same as what the old medieval parishes structure and size was. Well, our first reference to Kirkcaldy in any charter was in 1075. This is when a priory was formed in Dunfermline, and of course an upkeep of a priory required finance, it required money, and very often that was achieved by the creation of charters where the priory was endowed with certain means of receiving revenue, and indeed one of the revenues was from the lands of the Shire of Kirkcaldy. An interesting situation occurred with that, because that charter does not seem to have actually ever been enforced, and one of the reasons at least seems to be because the person who claimed that they owned that land historically was one of the Macduff family, and there was no doubt the Macduffs were extremely powerful people in the southern part of Fife, and it would be no surprise where the most senior of the Macduff clan would not be happy that his lands, as he saw it, was being given to Dunfermline Priory. So it appears that although the charter is referred to in subsequent charters, that it was never actually evoked. But then later, in the reign of David I, who was the youngest son of Malcolm Canmore and Margaret, he was indeed a great reformer and took on board so much of his mother's early beginnings in terms of reform, and really consolidated things. And indeed, in 1128, when the Benedictine Abbey of the Holy Trinity and St Margaret in Dunfermline, of course that is Dunfermline Abbey, was formed, then up came again a charter, and again that referred to the lands and church of the Shire of Kirkcaldy, and that was indeed evoked, and therefore by implication this place called Kirkcaldy was in the possession of the Abbey Church in Dunfermline. So, why Kirkcaldy area? Well, several reasons really. very agricultural land, and therefore the abbey could charge rentals as income, and also various other taxes, and also very, very importantly, it was tucked into what is called Kirkcaldy Bay, and it has a very good harbour area, a haven for ships. And again, that would mean that trade could be exploited as well. But probably the most significant reason was that what could be created was basically a new town. And Kirkcaldy displays all the features, the attributes of a medieval town or borough, in as much as it has got a main street with a wider area for a market, and also down both sides of the street what are known as Burgess plots, and these Burgess plots are owned or at least rented by local inhabitants. And again, you can create much more commercial activities if you start to have a merchant class and also an artisan class which is making various goods. So you've created plenty scope for making further inroads into revenue generation. This is somewhat illustrated in an early 19th century map, the Moor map, which shows the long street, it shows the harbour, it shows the Burgess plots, it shows a wider area where the market was, and of course the church, the old kirk, is also on that map too. Subsequent charters basically reaffirmed the church's role, the Abbey Church in Dunfermline's role with respect to Kirkcaldy. There was one by Robert I, that's Robert the Bruce in 1327, and a subsequent one which was in 1363, that was David II, and that is when Kirkcaldy was confirmed as what is known as a borough of regality. The next significant date was a charter in 1451, and that was a different type of charter, because that was a charter which turned Kirkcaldy's status into a few firm. And what that basically meant is, for the first time, that the Burgesses of Kirkcaldy could elect bailies, and basically the borough could look after itself, and all it needed to do on an annual basis was pay a sum of money to the Abbey Church, and it would then get on with things itself, and therefore by implication the Abbey Church had less control. It still basically owned Kirkcaldy, but with a lighter touch. That particular charter in 1451 refers to a small but functioning harbour, and that of course was extremely key to Kirkcaldy in later centuries. Okay, that's fine for charters for the moment. We'll come back to that. 3 quick maps. The first one is a modern Google map. and the second one is an ordnance survey map. Note the two coloured dots. The start point is the green one, and the red dot is the end point. These are located on two burns. The green one on what's known as the East Burn, and the red one on what was called the Burley Burn, because this was the extent of the borough along the coast. But again, more about that later on too. Okay, let's get off and running at the green spot at the mouth of the East Burn. But that's where the problem starts, is because originally the East Burn's entry point into the Firth of Forth is not quite exactly where it is just now, and therefore it's very, very difficult to get a photograph of where it would have been. I mean, most certainly that would have been an ideal spot for inhabitants over literally millennia, because of running drinkable water, and also probably a bit of a shingle beach for pulling your boats up, which would have been very, very useful as a place to do fishing, etc., etc. But regrettably, as I say, I cannot replicate that now. So the best I've got is we've got a photo of very close to where it would have been, and you notice that we are outside the Scottish wastewater treatment works down at that point. And the next three pictures are indeed the East Burn. The line of the East Burn now runs right beside the long harbour wall. But as I say, that is not where the burn used to be at all. That is deposited land over the last few decades. As I've already said, the harbour is so important to Kirkcaldy. The harbour has changed markedly over many centuries. Borough records are continually have references to the harbour. Very often, it has to be said, it requiring to be repaired. But of course, there have been many expansions and extensions to the harbour, and the most recent one was completed in 1909 and was opened in 1910, and that was largely because Kirkcaldy had expanded so much as an industrial town and required a much bigger harbour. A whole virtual walkabout to itself could be created for the harbour area. So I hope you enjoy the range of photographs in the next part. Notice it's still used as a working harbour. Cars use it for grain handlers, and indeed some of the photos indicate the grain handler being unloaded. If we return back to the High Street, just outside the harbour, we have a significant listed building, which is the facade to the St Mary's Canvas Works, which was part of the Nairn Linoleum Empire. A plaque on a door at that end of the High Street. Very apt, shipping house. A very important part of Kirkcaldy's rich heritage, its commercial heritage. This is a photo of Sailor's Walk. Indeed, it's actually two buildings adjoining each other, and these buildings are the buildings which are at the foot of Malcolm's Wynd, which was the very, very start of this heritage walk. The harbour, of course, being immediately right across the road. These buildings were built in the 16th century and, of course, were renovated in the 20th century and are in the ownership of the National Trust for Scotland. Kirkcaldy has a lot of very elegant buildings. A wee bit further along the street we have Harbour House, which was an early 19th century dwelling house. It is flanked on its front on both sides by two pavilions. An excellent example of renovation work was done in the last few years, and let's hope that that trend in terms of renovating excellent old buildings does continue. We have now come along past the junction with Coal Wynd, and we are in the Port Bray area now. The building you see was called St James's Church. It was built in 1842 and was eventually demolished in 1970, which was 2 years after its closure. Its last minister, the Reverend Williamson, he continued with open-air services even after it was closed until his own death in 1971, and one of the streets in the new flats at the harbour is called Williamson's Quay after him. There is also a plaque commemorating St James's Church on the seawall quite close to the site. I should also indicate that this particular area of Kirkcaldy was heavily industrialised over many, many centuries. The production of salt took place. Salt was one of Kirkcaldy's many large-scale exports, and very close to the site of St James's Church there were a number of salt pans where the coal, which was mined in copious amounts in this area of Kirkcaldy, was burned underneath pans which contained seawater, and the water was evaporated off, was boiled off, and of course it left salt, and the salt was subsequently bagged, and a lot of it, as I say, was exported from the harbour literally next door. A lot of interesting aspects in this picture. Right in the very, very middle there is the Port Bray Cinema. At one time Kirkcaldy had about 10 cinemas, of which this was one. This particular cinema opened in October of 1913 and eventually closed in 1940, and of course has subsequently been demolished. The building which is on the right hand side is of course Merchant House, sometimes called Law's Close. It is a merchant house which goes back to the late 16th century and was owned by the Law family. A very, very interesting building indeed. The building was renovated in the 70s and is at least partially open to the public. It is interesting in the sense that it was a merchant's house, and that was very, very important for Kirkcaldy, was its merchant classes, some of them very, very rich. And of course, behind the actual house itself is the long rig gardens, which again are very, very indicative of ancient boroughs and their structure in terms of burgess plots. What you also see is in the foreground is the steps, which were at one time extremely popular with people who would sit and enjoy the sunshine sitting on these steps and indeed paddling in the water. Now, of course, that is not possible since the rebuilding of the seawall quite recently. That is entirely covered with a rock revetment. You don't quite see it in the picture, but in the front and to the left is the esplanade, now called the waterfront, which was constructed in 1922 as one of the job creation schemes for unemployed people after the First World War. Before that, it was simply called Sands Road, but of course there is some renovation work going on in terms of that road at the moment as well. What you see just slightly to the right of the entrance to the Portbury Cinema is indeed the High Street itself, and that's what we will return to now. Okay, we are now going along the High Street. On the left-hand side, we see the job centre that was opened in the 1970s and replaced a red brick building, a sandstone building, which was on the esplanade. The job centre, of course, has subsequently moved up to Hunter Street. Across the other side of the street, of course, we have one of those iconic symbols of old Kirkcaldy, and older people still reminiscence about it, and that is the Green Cockatoo restaurant, which was extremely popular for a period of time, and as I say, people still talk about, I remember having my cup of tea and my cake in the Green Cockatoo. Okay, a bit further along, not a lot though, we pass Redburn Wynd, and of course Kirkcaldy has a number of old burns which used to flow from higher ground, of which Redburn was one of them. Right next door to that, we have a great red sandstone building, which is a B-listed building. That building was built in 1904, and that was built as the 2,000-seater King's Theatre, and it was designed by local architect John T. Swanson. It changed its name many times over its lifetime, after having become a cinema. So it was called the Hippodrome at one time, then it became the Opera House, then it became the Regal, then it became the ABC. As I say, nothing particularly unusual in terms of cinemas, but finally was closed in 2000. Thankfully, through the help of a local philanthropist, the cinema, and also the YW building down at the waterfront has been purchased, and a local community group, King's Theatre, is now endeavouring to develop the whole site, and we wish them all the best in their endeavours. A little bit further along again, two significant buildings here. The building which is on the centre right is the Beverages building, and that is on a prominent site. It housed beverages, retail, which was locally owned for many, many decades, and of course above that there is flats. The building slightly to the left of that, a light coloured building, is the Co-op building. The Co-op building was built to replace in 1975 a previous Co-op building which was subject to an extensive fire and became dangerous and had to be demolished. If we pass that site at the moment, of course it is a GAP site, and that GAP site has a planning application current for shops and flats as well, and we'll wait and see what happens with that. Okay, a lot to cover in the next 6 photos and illustrations. The first one is a very, very interesting engraving of the market, what was the market area of Kirkcaldy in around about the 1840s. Look at the stagecoach coming through. Look at the apparel which people are wearing. This is at the foot of Kirkcaldy, so this is the series of photos which depict this over many, many years. A very, very prominent building here, of course, is the Swan Memorial Building. That building was erected in 1896, and that was to commemorate a very, very important person in Kirkcaldy's 19th century history, industrialist and philanthropist, Patrick Don Swan. And he was definitely one of life's larger-than-life characters, and he was very worthy of being commemorated. This particular building housed the YMCA until 1972, till the YM moved up to Valley Gardens. Also in the photograph we have a very good selection of styles of houses from the 18th century into the 19th century and indeed beyond. So this photo is taken at the foot of Kirkcaldy, and if you look up the wind, then further up you see the tower of the old kirk. And as I mentioned previously, of course, the church, the kirk, was very, very important part of life in any borough, and people would of course flock to the church on a Sunday for the Sunday service. And quite a considerable flow of people would indeed go up Kirkcaldy itself. The old kirk tower is to be restored, and appropriate funding is being sought for that at the moment. The Swan Memorial Building that I talked about in the previous dialogue of course, is not in the picture here. What you're actually looking at on the right hand side of Kirkcaldy is the building which was there previous to that. Also see in the foreground on both sides the big stones. And the idea there was that was to stop people cutting corners and knocking off the sides of buildings when they were going past with their various carts. We're still at the foot of Kirkcaldy, but we're looking across the street to the seaward side. One very noticeable aspect of boroughs was that many of the prominent buildings were banks which appeared in the late 18th century and during the 19th century and even into the 20th century. Here we have the one of the banks. This is the Clydesdale Bank. It was indeed built in 1908. Some of them were extremely fancy facades. What is regrettable, of course, is that almost no banks exist in Kirkcaldy High Street. This one, of course, has been closed for a number of years now, and hopefully this building will be developed at some time on a very prominent site in the very near future. Slightly to the left of that is 220 High Street. That was where the site of the house which Adam Smith stayed in for a considerable period of his life. Adam Smith being one of Kirkcaldy's famous sons and the author of both the Theory of Moral Sentiments and the Wealth of Nations. But Adam Smith himself is such an important person, he will be featured as one of our footsteps of Adam Smith in Kirkcaldy virtual walkabouts in the very near future. Next two photos. We're in that wider part of Kirkcaldy High Street, which was, of course, traditionally the market space. The first photo looks towards the West End, and the second one looks towards the East End from more or less the same point. In the first picture, very particularly look at the tower on the slightly to the left of centre. That tower, which also had a clock on it, was the old townhouse before the townhouse moved to its current site in the 1950s. The great and good of Kirkcaldy would meet as councillors in that building over a century. Notice the shops, notice the awnings on the second photograph, and let us think of a time in the future where Kirkcaldy High Street and its retail offering is transformed again, and some of that transformation hopefully will be with individual shops again. Back to a recurring theme in Kirkcaldy, that of cinemas. The cinema, which is highlighted here, this is three photos, was the Rialto cinema, and the Rialto was first built in 1925. It, of course, also changed its name. It was also called the Gomment, and latterly it was called the Odeon. Regrettably, again, like so many of Kirkcaldy's prominent buildings, it was destroyed by fire, and that was in 1975. And of course, the site has been replaced since then. So very close to where the Odeon used to be. Two famous names in terms of Kirkcaldy shops, individual shops, James Burt's and Edward Sang's. Again, when it comes to reminiscence work, how often these two shops crop up in conversation. Just a wee bit further along from there, of course, there is the opening which takes you down to Tollbooth Street, and of course, as I've previously mentioned, the townhouse with its clock tower, which of course became the Marks and Spencer's building in 1938. Like everywhere, Kirkcaldy liked to celebrate things, so we have a series of 3 photos. First one is the royal visit. The Queen visited Kirkcaldy in 1953 to open the new town house. The second photograph is the celebration of the circus coming to town, and the third one is illustrates the Kirkcaldy pageant, which took place annually and started up at the ice rink car park and worked its way down through Kirkcaldy to the central area. Changing the theme a wee bit, the high street over the many years, transportation along it. And of course, if there is one thing which has changed considerably over the last 150 years, it certainly is how to get along the high street. So a mixture of trams and buses and cars and carts. So this will give you an opportunity of possibly even starting and stopping and rewinding the YouTube video in order to study some of the fine details of these next set of pictures. Okay, we're now at the foot of White's Causeway. That almost exactly where the picture is taken is where the west port of the town stood several centuries ago. There were 3 ports, 3 gates into the town. This was one of them. The one other one was at the Port Bray, and the other one was coming down Kirkwynd, and that was the Kirk port. Again, back to Kirkcaldy's medieval past. Kirkcaldy had no walls. The motto is Vigilando Munio. It means that we all vigilantly protect the town. And that was, as I say, not done by using walls, but gates were used, and gates were very much used at times of epidemics, because at that time you didn't want anybody who possibly had any ailment to enter the town itself, and if someone was found, then they were thrown out and they were potentially fined as well. What we also see in the building is the White House Mansions, which was built in the very late 19th century, a fine example of late Victorian architecture, combining both shops on the ground floor and houses, flats above it. Well, also at the foot of White's Causeway, on the other side, we have, well, and it doesn't come much more imposing than this in Kirkcaldy, the Burton's building, which was built in the Art Deco style and was opened in 1937. as well as the retail downstairs. Of course, the Plaza Ballroom, again very well known to some of our more elderly residents in Kirkcaldy. The third of the pictures indicates one of the three founding stones, which is tucked into one of the corners of the building. Okay, getting closer to the home straight now. Next three photos illustrate again very much some of the localism in Kirkcaldy. We have, to start off with, the Hardy and Company shop, then we have Oliver Melville's, and then we have Stuart's Restaurant. Continue along the High Street and we come to another crossroads, the crossroads of White House Avenue and the Charlotte Street. Charlotte Street was built in the late 18th century as Kirkcaldy connected the High Street down to the waterfront area. Down that area, of course, was just over 8 acres worth of common ground, which was given to Kirkcaldy by Charles I in a 1644 charter, when eventually Kirkcaldy became a royal borough, having previously been a royal borough in name and had acted as a royal borough and had been allowed to go to the Convention of Royal Boroughs at least a century before that. But by 1644 it got the stamp of royal approval as a royal borough. The picture we see here is a wee bit further along from Charlotte Street, just on the corner with Glassworks Street. This is Kirkcaldy's People's Club and Institute. So what do they say about a misspent youth and playing too much snooker and billiards? Well, I wonder if that was Kirkcaldy's misspent youth locations. It's still open and is very welcoming to visitors. In quite recent years, along at various points in the High Street, the local authority, Fife Council, have put in date stamp plaques into the pavement, which indicate a whole range of small and medium-sized businesses that have contributed to the High Street as merchants, traders, and artisans over the many years, and this is a couple of examples. We're right at the West End, as we call it in Kirkcaldy, of the High Street. The next three photos are over a period of time, pre-tram, during tram, and much more recent than that. Two very iconic buildings that you will see. One is the West End Congregational Church, the spire on the left, and the other spire is the Holyrood Church, which of course has been, as you see in the third picture, it has been demolished now because it became unsafe. And finally, but last but not least, we have arrived at one High Street, the further extent of the High Street. If you remember way back at the very, very start, I said the red dot. The building on the immediate left of this is the Weems building. The Weems building was in the Lincoln of Abbots Hall. It was outside the boundary of Kirkcaldy. Deep in the past, where the number 1 High Street building is where the burn flowed down, which was called the Burley Burn. And as I say, that was the extent of the boundary of the old royal borough of Kirkcaldy. I hope you've enjoyed our virtual walk along Kirkcaldy High Street, and we've taken in some of the ancient history of Kirkcaldy as well. We will be expanding our series of virtual walks over the next year or so.